Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and welcome to this afternoon's Tertulia event, panel on the war in Ukraine, entitled Race, Citizenship, Refugees, and Realism. I'm going to let Tracy introduce the speakers, but before I do, I want to acknowledge that the organizers of today's event are coming from the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey people, and the territory here is bound by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of the 1700s. The land that we're on has never been ceded. And we remind people about this at the start of our events because of the very unequal ways that this land has been used to enrich certain people on this territory and to impoverish others. So without further ado, I will pass this on to Tracy Glenn.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. So yeah, welcome everybody. Our first speaker, we're going to go in this order. So Roger Boyd is a fellow at the Dalhousie School of International Affairs and graduate of the Global Governance PhD program there. His research is focused on the joint transitions of global power politics and the global energy system to low carbon sources, with a specific focus on the interactions and dependencies of the two. He's the author of Energy in the Financial System, published by Springer. And most recently, Roger has completed a novel based on a future climate change-driven crisis. So Roger is speaking, discussing a realist approach to the Russian war on the Ukraine and this is something that he recently published in Canadian Dimension, a piece on this he'll be exploring or going beyond, the emotional responses to the war and the distortions of propaganda, and question the West's role in spreading war in the Ukraine and other parts of the world. And then after Roger, we have Raluca Bejan and Renee Bogovich. So they'll be discussing refugees fleeing Ukraine as a result of the Russian invasion, and question whether the welcoming of Ukrainians into Eastern Europe, unlike Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, and Eritreans, is because they are white. So looking at questions of race and citizenship, and they have a think piece published in the conversation about this, and if you all got the event notice, you have links to that. So Raluca Bejan is an assistant professor of social work at Dalhouse University, and many of you here today are from Fredericton, so you remember that Raluca was here from 2018 to 2019 here in Fredericton as an assistant professor of critical social policy in the School of Social Work at St. Thomas University. Raluca was a former visiting academic at the Center on Migration Policy and Society, COMPAS, at Oxford in 2016 and 2018. Raluca is the book review editor for Refuge, Canada's Journal on Refugees, and is leading various research projects, including the Refugee Integration in Southeast Europe project and Temporary Foreign Workers in the Maritimes during COVID project. And in 2018, Raluca co-directed Trace, a documentary film on the Greek refugee crisis. Rene Bogovic is a sociology PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. His doctoral research explores the role of mother tongue and everyday language use in the formation, reformation, and negotiation of post-apartheid ethno-racial boundaries, with a focus on the multiracial Africans speech community in Western Cape and South Africa. So Renee is also a team member of the Refugee Integration in Southeast Europe RISEE project, and he's focusing on the Western Balkan refugee route. So that's our speakers that we're lucky to have them today. So I'm gonna turn it over to Roger.
Thank you. I think when we look at the Ukrainian crisis, anything like this doesn't just happen. There's a history behind it. We need to look at that history. We really go back 30 years to 1989, 1990, when we were looking at the reunification of Germany. And as a part of the deal for that reunification, NATO and the West committed repeatedly to the then leader of Russia, of the USSR actually, that NATO would not go 1 inch further into Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe was really seen as probably becoming a kind of demilitarized peaceful zone between the two entities. Now, then of course we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and along came a chap called Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia, who we kind of liked. Yeltsin was, he was a very good Yeltsin. He was rather drunk, but he was a very good Yeltsin to us. He shelled the Russian parliament in 1993 when he had a difficulty with them, even with the parliamentarians in the parliament. He stole the 1996 election with the help of the oligarchs, the US and the IMF. And he facilitated the absolute looting of Russia by the oligarchs and the West, and the halving of GDP, and knocking about 8 years off the average life expectancy of the Russian male. But we liked him because he did what we wanted him to do, and he's very supportive, and that's what the West does with people we like. We call them nice, we call them Democrats, even if they're not Democrats. At the end of this period in 1999, the first rollback of those promises to Gorbachev was made when the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO. So the promise lasted about 9 years. Then also in 1999, along came a guy called Vladimir Putin. And when he first came along, he was the good Putin. We really liked Vladimir Putin. There was things in the press saying what a great friend he was to G.W. Bush. He helped the Americans actually in Afghanistan. He talked about wanting to join NATO, even as one ex-NATO official has stated recently. And he was a good guy. He was wonderful until 2003. And suddenly he wasn't good anymore. Suddenly he was Hitler, crazy Putin, demagogue Putin, autocrat Putin, because he stopped taking instructions. He did something we didn't like. He actually went after one of the thieves from the 1990s, an oligarch called Khodorkovsky, who was in the process of selling a large chunk of the oil reserves of Russia to Exxon, a US corporation, which was directly against the national interest of Russia. So he did some nasty things. I'm sure some of it wasn't illegal, but he basically took down Khodorkovsky and nationalized those resources. And the oligarchs are basically told that they could keep their money as long as they don't do anything against the national interests of Russia, or probably against Putin's friends as well. So suddenly Putin became bad Putin. Then in 2004, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, the Baltic republics joined NATO as well. So basically all of what used to be the Warsaw Pact in the post-World War II period and now joined NATO. And NATO was trundling across the plains of Europe towards Russia itself. In 2007, Vladimir Putin went to the Munich Security Conference and basically stated his concerns that NATO was becoming an aggressive force that was marching towards actual Russia itself. Also, of course, having been directly involved in the bombing of Serbia for approximately 79 days, including many civilian targets and bridges, etc., that a certain Mr. Beijon was very heavily involved in and actually boasted he fully supported. The response of the West was dismissive, go away, don't bother us. Then in 2008, a country called Georgia, which was trained and armed by the West, attacked the breakaway republics, which had Russian peacemakers in them. And there was a war between Russia and Georgia, which Russia very handily won. Then in 2004-05, also there was the Orange Revolution, which overthrew a Russian-leaning leader in the Ukraine and imposed a Western-leaning in Ukraine. Now we can always know what orange revolutions, velvet revolutions actually mean. It's regime change. So if you're from Russia, all you're seeing is the West slowly moving into your borders. And the leaders of the Ukraine at the time very much wanted to be part of the EU and part of NATO, and were very aggressively anti-Russia. In 2010, the concerns about Ukraine were somewhat mollified because in an election, the Russia-leaning, or at least the not Western-leaning leader, Yanukovych, was elected, and therefore Russia had less to worry about. But also we had, in 2011, the NATO usage of a no-fly zone to do regime change in Libya, which was an ally of Russia, and then also to help turn a Syrian civil war into a horrendous conflict, fully funded and paid for by foreign powers. which in 2015, Putin then did something the West didn't like, which was actually stop the regime change by intervening in Syria. So throughout this whole process, all that Russia has seen is the West attempting to march all the way to its borders and overthrow its allies. And in the middle of this also, we had the 2014 coup. It was a coup. It was the overthrow of the elected leader of a country and the installation of Western-leaning leaders, with which US politicians, etc., were greatly involved with. You can see that just from newsreels at the time, and also intercepted telephone calls, etc. There was accords attempting to fix the problem of the Donbass, the Minsk I and Minsk II accords, which there was absolutely no pressure from the West for the Ukrainian government to impose. And instead, there was continuous shelling of civilians in the Donbass by the Ukrainian military upon its own citizenry, resulting in the deaths of over 13,000 civilians in the Donbass. At the same time, we now march forward and we get to a point in 2019, which is an extremely interesting report was written by a company called RAND. They're actually a consultancy of the military security services of the US, which is right at the think tank, which thinks out things. And it was called How to Overextend an Unbalanced Russia. You can actually go to the RAND Corporation website and see this. And they listed all the possibilities, and it seems they just went through the plan. Provide lethal aid to the Ukraine, tick. Increase support to Syrian rebels, tick. Promote, in quotes, liberalization of Belarus, i.e. regime change, tick. That happened in 2020 and 2021. Expand ties in the South Caucasus. There was a little war involving Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus. So that's a tick. Reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. There was an attempted coup in Kazakhstan actually last year. So a tick on that as well. I think the only thing they didn't do was try to flip Transnistria. So if you're the Russian leadership, you're looking at this plan going, well, they told us what the plan was and they're carrying it out. The plan is regime change in Russia. So reduce the strength of Russia, drive it down and do regime change. Something which a certain president said out loud when he shouldn't have quite recently. So then we come to 2021. The Russians have had enough talking and they go, we will write down our security demands to the West. That's explicitly what was done. Russia wrote down its security demands, which basically said Ukraine could not be in NATO. Ukraine had to be demilitarized. The Minsk Accords had to be implemented. And NATO could no longer be an aggressive force marching towards Russia and looking directly at destabilizing Russia. That was again refused. And then we had the leadership of the Ukraine explicitly talking about joining NATO, NATO leaders definitely not saying it wasn't going to happen. And then the leader of the Ukraine talking about building nuclear weapons, which Ukraine actually has the capability of doing. It actually used to be a large producer of Russian ICBMs at the Soviet Union days. So we've had this process continuously. In the end, when you push an animal into a corner, it attacks. So that's what Russia did, it attacked. Is war a horrible thing? Absolutely. Is people dying a horrible thing? Absolutely. But is the logic of the Russian leadership very simple logic? Yes. They are existentially threatened, i.e. the whole existence of the Russian regime and the Russian nation is threatened, and therefore they will go to war to carry that out. And no matter how many actions taken by the West against Russia, you will not stop a country going to war to protect its very existence. That is a reality. Russia was pushed to the point where that became a reality. At any point during this period, the West could have agreed, Ukraine won't be part of NATO, we won't push the borders any further, we will have a security agreement with Russia. There would not have been this war. And again, is Vladimir Putin a nice person? I'm sure he's not very nice. I'm sure he's maybe even a psychopathic, very logical thinker, but that's what most of the world's leaders are in reality when they think about foreign policy. So it's not about who Vladimir Putin is, how he is, what kind of leader he is, whether he's nice to his children, whether people are dying in the Ukraine. It's about the simple thing that the forward movement of NATO towards Russia and the explicit statements about regime change within Russia and the explicit attempts at regime change within the bordering nations of Russia drove Russia to a point where its only option was to invade the Ukraine. And that is where we stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So you definitely give us a lot to, I'm sure, discuss. So as Matthew posted in the chat room, if you have questions, comments, please post into the chat room, and we will we will get there after we hear from Raluca and Renee about what they have to say about refugees and questions. They're going to be further questioning some of the narratives that we're hearing. So. Hand it over to Renee and Raluca.
Thank you, Tracy. So I think the way we're going to sort of do this section will be a little bit more informal, and we're just going to go back and forward between us. So basically, and I guess our invitation here followed up from an article that we have written for the conversation, in which we have tried to sort of problematize this logic in which the Ukrainian refugees are sort of labeled as white, and from here there's sort of inferences of being privileged refugees compared to sort of other groups of refugees throughout time. And basically what we have argued in that article, and we're going to go through several points back and forward between us, is that the story is much more complex, and we just want to insist on certain variables that sort of make this the situation more complex and sort of problematize the logic that we have been oftentimes seeing it flowing around in the media. So I will start with basically one point. So a first point would be that actually a regional logic has always, in a way, underpinned refugee flows. So I'm not saying, and we didn't say in this article that, this is good or this is bad, but that just basically, this is what's happening. So if you look, let's say, historically, for instance, if you look at the Syrian conflict, if you look at the countries around it, you'll see that Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey have settled the largest number of Syrians. So more than half of all Syrian refugees are actually registered within these countries. Turkey hosts close to 4 million, Lebanon over 800,000, Jordan close to 700,000, for example. If you look at another example, let's say the Eritrean refugees, in about out of 500,000 of Eritrean refugees, more than half are registered in the neighboring country of Ethiopia and Sudan. Again, then if you look at the Rohingya refugees from the neighboring Myanmar, you will see that Bangladesh hosts close to 900,000 of the Rohingya refugees. So basically, a regional logic always underpinned forced migration movement. So people just, it's the first impulse to go to the country next to it. Also because, of course, and the story gets more complicated, there are several ties, cultural, linguistic, and in relation to the other countries. Rene, do you want to sort of add anything to this point?
Yeah, and I think that both of me and Raluca have been looking at refugee flows across the world. I've recently reviewed a book about the refugee crisis in Zimbabwe, and Raluca has worked on projects looking at refugees in Canada, and now we're looking at the Balkans. And one of the things that I think kept coming up over and over again is the importance of contextualizing the flows that we're seeing. And that applies to the categories through which we are looking at the people coming in. And race can be very useful in many contexts, but we need to contextualize the meaning of race across different spaces. And here we are dealing with a space, as Roger has mentioned, that doesn't quite fit very easily within the usual spaces that we explore, that being the relationship between the global north and the global south. And I think our exhortation is to really contextualize rather than like a outright critique of focusing on race in all contexts, cross contexts. In this case, within the geopolitics, is which really should be our starting point, as Raluca mentioned, starting from mentioning the closeness of the country being one of the things that we have to consider. Another thing I want to add just to this point before I give the baton back to Raluca is also, we are talking here about countries that have not only been close in their relationship geopolitically to the wider context of both Russia and the West, but also linguistically. Ukrainian and dialect of Polish, especially those at the border, are fairly mutually intelligible. And then there is also established labor flows across the country that have been ongoing for decades. So we're talking about an integrated system. So when Ukrainians are crossing the borders, the label of them as foreign nationals is one that needs to be contextualized. Raluca, back to you.
Thank you, Rene. I think yes, that's a very strong point, because, and then I think we'll go later on to sort of how refugee subjects are classified by, let's say, EU law and EU migration governance structures, and how they end up being, having different set of rights because of sort of these categorizations. But I think also, in terms of this closeness, I think part of the reason. So first of all, and I think I just want to make a parenthesis. Roger Brubaker always has been he has argued that we have race as a category of practice, and race as an explanatory category. So I think race works descriptively as a category of practice in this issue, to say, okay, yes, indeed, some of the Ukrainian refugees perhaps had been a different treatment at the borders. But I think the problem is when we try to use race as the primary explanatory determinant for what has been happening at the borders, and specifically for a lot of medical students from the African countries, let's say, exclusion in terms of their movement. And I think Rene has mentioned ethnic composition and regional labor market flows, but I also want to say in terms of, and again, I'm originally from Romania, so I'll use some examples from there. So we have, Romanians, for instance, are the third ethnic minority in Ukraine. Then again, we have a large Ukrainian minorities in Romania, because also, as this Southeast Europe has been an area that has been in so many different sort of nation formations before as they are currently right now. So, and I think, for instance, part of Romania is now under Ukraine. So of course, you'll have people who in a way are so close together. And I think, again, in Romania, you have, for instance, an Ukrainian political party that has one seat in the parliament. So it's very different in terms of having a connection. Obviously, Romanians are going to feel more of a connections with Ukrainians when you have, a representative of the Ukrainian ethnic party in the parliament, when you have, people crossing the border for medical appointments and etc., which is again very common, where you have people who have sort of families in the border towns. So I think this sort of level of closeness definitely plays a role. And I think from here, we can also talk a little bit on sort of this pre-existing ideological affinities. So, what happens in '89 when the USSR falls, I think, disappeared. Basically the anti-Soviet sentiment, the anti-communist sentiment translated in a lot of the, anti-Russian sentiment. And oftentimes these Eastern European countries also share this sort of ideological positioning of being, we've been through the same thing that we have been through. And I think, this is very common. A friend of mine was saying, the most disturbing is that you look at the TV and you see those communist flats in Ukraine, and that could be your flat where you grow up. And I think, that also plays a role in terms of, yes, perhaps, the Eastern European surrounding countries might feel more empathy for the Ukrainian refugees, but I think it is also sort of this shared history that we had, and also this sort of shared ideological rejection of Russia, because the anti-communist system is very strong in the East, and I think this anti-communist sentiment, a lot of time has translated into a very strong, anti-Russian sentiment. And another point I want to also point out is the religious affinity. So again, Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is very, very strong in Eastern Europe, and Romanians and Ukrainians are all again, both Orthodox nations, and that also plays a very huge role in terms of how you would empathize with the other. Religious affinity plays a strong role. And then I don't know if Renee wants to add anything. I think before we sort of move into this relationship that Ukraine has with the European Union, because I think that also plays an important part in the discussion.
No, feel free to introduce that point. I'll certainly have something to add.
Okay, so I think we also have to realize that, okay, so oftentimes people have been comparing Syrian and Afghan refugees, saying that they have, that they have been subject to a worse treatment at the border. But I think one issue that is important to note is that in EU law, Syrians will be classified as third country nationals. So that means they are, EU is extremely hierarchical. So at the top, you have the member states, which are, the funder member states. And then you have those who came after. Then you have, sort of the Central Eastern European states. Then you have, the Eastern Europe proper poor nations, such as Romania and Bulgaria. And everyone has sort of different rights within this Eastern European Union. And, if you look below, all the EU member states are going to be the subjects of the country who are in the process of EU integration, which is, again, Ukrainians. Ukraine is in the process of EU integration. And I think also, and this could be, of course, an important point that we can connect with the discussion from Roger, because the desire in the East to join this governance body because of the poverty that the East is suffering. And I think this needs to be acknowledged. Minimum wage in Ukraine is 250 Canadian dollars a month. So I think, there's also a desire to escape this poverty by joining EU, by having freedom of movement, to go get a better job, to send money home. This sort of Western, the integration in West, it's of course has been also desired, but because of this desire for integration into the West, Ukrainians are classified as different type of, right now, refugee subjects. Okay, so for example, Ukraine has in its constitution the integration to NATO and integration to European Union, for instance. Then Ukraine has also signed several agreements with European Union, such as the ENP, which is the European Neighborhood Policy, and the 2014 EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. And because of this sort of agreements that they have, Ukrainians are also allowed into the Schengen space, for instance, for a period up to 90 days. So, if we use the Arendian terminology of who has the right to have rights, according to the EU law, Ukrainians will have more rights to have rights compared to the Syrian refugees or the Afghan refugees, particularly because they have a special relationship with the EU. So they're not part of the EU, but they are with, one foot inside the EU and one foot outside of it. But that sort of, ambivalent positioning sort of creates them legally as more sort of privileged subject. But I think this has something to do with nationality, and not necessarily so much with race per se.
Yeah, and I think this is where we've aimed our contribution to really focus at this nexus. And another thing that I want to point out is that our analysis, it's specifically focusing on Poland and Romania and the surrounding country that were part of the Eastern Bloc, because the dynamics that are occurring here are very different from dynamics that are occurring elsewhere. And our conversation does not leave out the fact that the representation of the crisis has been very racist in a lot of the media I've experienced in the West, possibly because it's been understood and looked at through a different prism, a prism that comes from a history of North American and Western history. And here we're dealing with a history which is quite distinct. And I also want to mention that a conversation, the conversations that are, and the power dynamics between the global North and global South need to be contextualized when we're talking about what I suggest, and some other writers are trying to push that term for the global East, the post-socialist space, whatever you want to call it, which has a different conversation with the global South. And we have to remember that there's been a long established tradition of alliances being made with what we would consider global South countries and Eastern European countries in terms of exchange of students, with a lot of the African students that we are observing, which have been victims of exclusion at the border, being precisely the continuation of this tradition of collaboration between the East and the South, intersecting with a new conversation, which in this case is a conversation of Western EU integration, which comes with a whole set of prerequisites of transformation, also on a structural level. So again, we need to talk about structure in this case. And in such a way, I think our approach is very pragmatic. We can do something, we can take very direct action, focusing on citizenship, focusing on immigration status, focusing on the precarity that student status means for a lot of students that also happen to be classified as third state nationals, and how that intersection plays out. Raluca?
Yes, I just want to sort of add a few points, because I think I found it extremely interesting how Western media completely sort of did not insist on the fact that, for instance, the Nigerian students were on temporary visas. So, you know, they are automatically, that's a position that, you know, by bureaucratic design actually, you know, depletes one of certain rights. I also think when, you know, the Western media also didn't mention at all the exclusion at the borders of Roma Ukrainian nationals, which are, you know, in a way, Ukrainian nationals with certain sort of rights, you know, of limited rights, okay, of movement within EU, but they're still experienced, you know, racist treatment at the border. And of course, you know, these are, I mean, we're not saying that racism does not exist. Obviously, you know, and most people who are, you know, working in law enforcement and at the borders and so on, right? I mean, you know, obviously there are going to be racist attitudes and etc. But I think that the idea of, you know, the actually right to move within certain spaces globally from a transnational perspective, I think it's a lot more connected with nationality in this case. And I also want to sort of make an accolade to the Canadian context, because I think here, again, there is this focus on how much the Ukrainians are welcomed into Canadian nation, because the state says it's going to accept an unlimited number of Ukrainian refugees. But, you know, if you were to look at that program, is a horribly designed program in which Ukrainians actually are not even coming as refugees. They're coming in as temporary people, as temporary subjects with an open work permit for a period up to 3 years. They're not coming in as refugees. That, you know, if I was to come in as a refugee from Ukraine, I could board a plane. Once I would arrive in Canada, I can say, I'm a refugee, and until my claim gets decided, I will have some access to state supports. If my claim gets accepted, the next day I can go and apply for PR. if my claim gets rejected, okay, that gets more complicated. But at least I'll have some sort of access of support. But if you come as a person with an open work permit, ironically, when Canada has an acute labor shortage for a lot of undesired jobs, it sort of makes you wonder, okay, is this really a welcoming of the Ukrainian refugees? This when all the Liberal members at the Standing Committee of Citizenship that took place on March 1st voted against lifting of the visa for Ukrainians. So they don't want to lift the visas, okay? So the visas are still in place. Canada still requires visas for the Ukrainians to come. They don't want to lift the visa because they know that will actually open the doors for more sort of refugees to come, but they bring, certain people on a temporary status. And who are these certain Ukrainian refugees? Because you need to do biometrics, you need to send your passport for processing in one of the countries, you need to apply online, you need to know English and French. So, they want to actually streamline some of the, richest Ukrainians, to be honest. But anyway, this is not something that we covered in our article, but I think, because Canada is a sort of white settler nation, I think de facto every time the tendency, the conventional way of explaining things is to sort of go to racial formation. But I think we have to realize that racial formations are not universal in every single part of the globe. And, here, of course, there has been slavery, but if you look in the Eastern Bloc, if you look at Tito, Ceausescu, etc., these were countries that actually fostered a certain collaborative patterns with many African nations. So the relationship have been quite different. It wasn't necessarily a superior and inferior relation. It was more one that was sort of more equal. And I think that needs to be acknowledged and needs to be complicated because honestly, I don't think everything can always be explained through this Anglo-American epistemological framework of understanding the world.
I think we're running short in time, and I can already see that in the chat there's quite a bit of interest. But yeah, I wanna add to Raluca's comments, also saying that working in the Western Balkans, we are here dealing with like a very religiously complex situation where about a third of former Yugoslavs are Muslim, and linguistically and phenotypically indistinguishable from the rest of the country. So all of those civilizational and racial and cultural lines that we are dealing with and taking for granted in let's say North America and the West tend to sort of come apart and need to be reconstituted in different ways. So contextualize if you want to make a difference.
Okay, thank you, Renee, and Raluca and Roger. Thank you so much for your words and for taking time today to talk to us, and also for all the work that you've been doing to make us question some of the ideas that are out there now about the Ukraine war. So I've started a speakers list. So Sean Narayan's going to, I think, voice his question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, I have questions for all of the speakers, but I'm going to focus for a moment on what Raluca and Renee have been talking about. It seems to me that you're just explaining why the racism exists. You're not actually refuting that it's there. You're giving it more complexity, but you're certainly not coming up with, to me anyway, a convincing argument that, in general, the Ukrainians and the Poles and the other people on the border didn't treat non-white people as lesser than because they were non-white. Now I know I've been all around the world, and I was just talking to my class this morning, and I've said to them, look, everywhere that I've been, racism has been extremely common and extremely accepted. And I'm most experienced with Asia. So I'm well aware of how tribal identities and other such of identities are paramount, and they often define how people see themselves and see others. So the fact that there's European racism, I think, is totally irrefutable. It's absolutely there. So I kind of hear you trying to make excuses for why it's there, as opposed to simply accepting that it's there, that it exists, that these non-white people were treated badly because they looked different and they came from a different place. And just, that's all it is. You can talk about European law if you want to, but let's face the fact that the European Union, in violation of international treaties that it signed, has actually been doing things like paying Turkey to keep millions of Syrians in Turkey so that they don't have to face the problem of refugees actually making legal claims in the European Union itself. So the European Union is more than happy to twist the law when it needs to for political reasons. I think this is all understandable if you accept the fact that tribalism is real. And in North America, maybe it's one of the few places in the world where we actually, as a principle, take the idea that tribalism and racism might be bad things. Everywhere else that I've been, it's kind of just taken for granted. So that's all. That's the only comment I wanted to make. And to Roger, I just wanted to quickly ask you. I agree with a great deal of what you said, and in fact, all of what you said, and you educated me on some points I wasn't even aware of. But I was kind of interested as to the article you published talked about realism. It said it was a realist take on the problem. I'm not entirely crazy about realism, and I was kind of curious if you could link what's happening in the Russian situation to China, because it seems to me that the Americans have been making remarkable effort to essentially blame China for what Russia is doing. And I think the two things are very strongly connected, in part for the reasons you said. So if you could respond to that, I'd be grateful. And I'll shut up now. I've probably said way too much.
Thank you, Sean. So I guess we'll go to Raluca, Renee, then Roger.
Okay, so I think, okay, so I don't agree with Sean that we are trying to formulate an excuse. And again, I think this idea that only North America tends to understand better what's the deal with race and what's the deal with everything. I again, coming from a space where that has been constantly erased from sort of from the Anglo-American knowledge production field, it's difficult to always sort of hear this, let's say, line of reasoning. And I think the confusion is always being made as, we synonymize somehow the European periphery with its center. And I think the problem is, oftentimes when you look at, let's say Poland, Poland was so violent with other refugees, we have to realize that it's not Poland.
I think we've lost
Poland being, pardon?
We've lost you for a second. Go ahead.
Sorry, there's nothing, organically embedded in Polish consciousness that's being in a certain way. I think this idea that the East is more racist than Western Europe is completely not backed up by any empirical evidence. So, everyone's racist, sure, but constantly saying that the Eastern Europe is the most racist, I think there's no empirical basis for it. And I think what's happening is that the EU wants to control who comes into its territory. I think all the nation states are doing that. I think Canada controls this probably much more stringently than a lot of places. I mean, Canada's lucky because it has a geography that no one's going to come here over the Atlantic in boats. That's not going to happen. So I think, if Canada will have 1 million people to try to come here, I think the story would be much, much more different. So I think that's also part of the issue. And I think that we need to realize that EU has been downloading responsibility to these Eastern European states to protect its borders. So EU has increased the Frontex budget by 3 times during the last 5 years to protect these borders. So this is coming from central EU, from Brussels, is not coming from, Romania or from some other one of these poor countries at the periphery. I just want to say that Romania, for instance, wanted to take 6,000 refugees in 2015, and it only managed to take 728 because no one wanted to come. And no one wanted to come because the minimum wage is 400 euros a month, and because 50% of the population lives beyond the low-income cutoff. So why would you want to go to Romania? Like I also left because of this, for instance. So, so I think it's, again, I just think it's more complicated, right? So I'm not trying to say the racism doesn't exist. I think it's more at play. I think nationality has more weight.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that the sort of the ways in which we want to look at this is to focus on what are those axes of inequality which are resulting in exclusion. We are not making any excuses. We are trying to define what is actually the process that singled these people out and made them wait in the cold for hours at the border. And is race the best and most pragmatic way to look at it, when race, to begin with, is a concept that has a lot of explanatory power when we are looking at settler societies and we are looking at colonial societies. And it has to be adapted and rethought in these different contexts. And we tried to fill in, Rogers also did his part, a huge gap in a conversation about this part of the world, this periphery, which is not Europe, which is not Western Europe, which is not a colonial enterprise, in 15 minutes. So these are not excuses. We're actually being whistleblowers on other axes of exclusion that we have to address in this case.
Can I quickly just add one thing, just again related to what Sean was saying, because I think, in Europe also it's such a difference, because if you are a Black American from New York coming to Europe, you're going to get a very different, you're going to actually get a better treatment than if you're, let's say, a whiter sort of looking Syrian refugees. So I think it's very important to sort of, right? So it's very, I think it's really complicated. I think, nationality in migration, who has access with their passport, where can you go in with that passport? I think that also really plays a huge role in this sort of, migration patterns, which in a way are from a nation state to a nation state. So I think we have to look at, what are criteria for inclusion into the nation state.
Okay, I'll address some of the questions as well. I'm not a realist scholar. I use realism because it's a very simple construct to tell a lot of detail about the relationship between the West and Russia currently. So it was a very straight way of describing that. I mean, if you really look at the overall story, you can take it back to 1490 and that Europe and the white settler colonies is basically a conquest of the globe. First of all, really set up as the classic white man's burden to, in quotes, civilize the uncivilized natives, or kill them, of course. And that's what was carried forward right through to about 1910, 1920, when you had President Wilson, the US president, which really transformed that into cultural language to hide the racial element of the language. And suddenly it was about sharing Western civilization. We carry it forward now to where we call any country we want to take over, we call them autocrats, or we call them terrorists or something else to do that. But it hasn't stopped the process by which basically Western elites want access to the resources of the rest of the world. And they want to be able to profit from those resources and benefit from them. And when we see in the current shade, since about the mid-1990s, that was a dream, a beautiful dream to Western elites. Suddenly the opposition went away. China was still nearly as poor as Africa in the early 90s. The East collapsed and suddenly they had access to a few more billion workers to actually utilize lots more resources. The countries that used to balance with the Soviet Union against the US couldn't anymore. And so they could get deep into those countries and open them up, liberalize them, shock therapy them, whatever we want to call that version of opening up societies and reducing their ability to control their own economies, which has really happened. Now we see there's really three nations which are in the way. Up until about 2010, China had very intelligently kept its head down. They actually called the policy keeping a low profile whilst they built up their economic might. And then in the early 2010s, China became much more assertive and said, no, I mean, we need to balance this. The US cannot be the unipolar power. And no, we're not going to allow your elite to basically control our economy. We're going to have the Chinese elite control the economy. With Putin, that was from 2003, that he explicitly said that. He said, no, you can't buy up our resources and control our economy. We'll do that ourselves. The third country is Iran, that has basically said the same thing. We actually had a revolution to overthrow the comprador leader of Iran, who was America's best friend, and now will actually manage our country for the benefit of Iranians. So all three nations are, of course, now defined as our enemies, and things are delineated in a very black and white way. But what we've actually created by this constant pressure to say, no, we will not accept you as equals, we only accept you as lesser thans that we exploit, the West has actually driven China and Russia together. My enemy's enemy is my best friend, and that's very much, even 10, 15 years ago, the thought of Russia and China getting together was like they're completely different nations. They just don't do this. They were at war in the 60s with each other. But now we have a very tight linkage because Russia and China know that the other one can't be allowed to fall. They can't allow the West to defeat Russia because the Chinese know they're next, and vice versa. And now also with the Iranians, which is a very strange relationship to have the Iranians aligned with the Russians, if you know the history of the two nations, but that's the reality. So of course, these nations are going to support each other. It's the only way they stay safe. Also for China, Russia protects the whole northern border of China, which has been historically a huge problem for the Chinese civilization. It also helps it control Central Asia, which backs onto Xinjiang and other very important provinces within China. It also supplies huge amounts of resources, oil, food, natural gas, you name it, Russia's supplying them. And in addition, Russia has also helped China develop their military, because the Russian military is better trained, better structured than the Chinese military. So you had a huge amount of that technology going back and forward. To Russia, it's the opposite. Right? Russia can withstand sanctions because they can buy goods from China. And they are protected by China. Also, you have the historical relationships between Russia and India actually now coming out, that the pressure, the really arrogance of the Americans to threaten the Indians with sanctions because they want to trade with Russia, you can see is actually moving elite opinion in India towards actually aligning with China and Russia. So this whole drive that the Americans and the West don't seem to be able to get off, which is just not being able to accept other nations as equals, is actually driving a coalition of forces which they cannot defeat. And that's what is currently happening, as we see with the sanctions which aren't working, with the attack on the ruble, which has been completely reversed, etc., etc. So that's why very much China will absolutely support Russia. It's in completely their interest, because they know that's, it's actually what Trump actually attempted to do, which was to take Russia away from China. It was a bit late by then. And that is the coalition now that the West faces. And also when we look at, we have to be very careful, we look at the mainstream media and they talk, the world is sanctioning Russia. No, Europe and the white settler colonies is sanctioning Russia. The other 9/10 of humanity is not. 3/4 of world GDP is not sanctioning Russia. And this is incredibly important. And the mainstream media, the propaganda which is used in the West, is much less of an impact in other areas of the world. So they see a much more balanced view of what is happening within the Ukraine crisis. They look at their own histories of colonialism and neo-colonialism and exploitation, and they much more identify. Why would they identify with the West? You even have Brazil, which was quite a shock, which will not align with the West against Russia, even though they have a right-wing Bolsonaro president right now. So I think that in some ways the West is being quite shocked. You can see that in some of the responses, that the rest of the world is not lining up, is not supporting them. And in many ways, the West is sanctioning itself rather than the other way around.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I think we should go to the next question. I think, is Chuck Fournier still with us?
Hello.
Okay, go ahead,
Hello.
Chuck.
Yeah, I guess following from your comment on propaganda, Roger, I guess my question was, what do you think is the biggest lie being told now, and what are its implications? And also, Renee and sorry, Raluca, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I was struck by, I mean, the European Union is important, yes, but what about the nature of the Polish state itself? From what I understand, Poland has an explicitly very right-wing government right now. I mean, I would like, for instance, if you compared Poland and France, I wouldn't say France is any less racist than Poland, but the Front National isn't in power, whereas the analogous political formation in Poland is in power. And what significance does that have to bear on the question of race and who gets in and who doesn't?
So to answer the first, I think the biggest lie, which happens so many times, is this definition of pure black and pure white of the parties, pure good and pure evil. And I think many people have been surprised by the extremity of the propaganda actions against Russia, but also individual Russians. It very much reminds one of the way in which Germans were treated in World War I or Japanese were treated in World War II, to the point where we're removing Russian musicians because they're Russian and they won't state that they're against their own president. It's a level of xenophobia and Russia hating, which is, if you look at, probably more extreme than during the Cold War. It is really that level. And then you've got the demonization of leaders happening, which cannot be walked back. Once you've demonized at a personal level another leader, at the level they've done it, it's extremely hard to walk back and actually make a compromise, which is the only way this will be sorted out in the end, is compromise. But how do you compromise when you've said these people are the Hitler, the devil, horrendous people, war criminals, worthy of their murderers, as Biden put it, etc. That's very hard to walk back. The other side is this, Ukraine is this wonderful country. It's not a wonderful country. The Western press, for many, many years now, has reported on Ukraine is not a democracy. It's run by an oligarchy. Zelensky is a creature of the oligarch Kolomoisky. And if you believe there's free and fair elections in Ukraine, I have a bridge I can sell you. It's ridiculous. And the reason Ukraine is so poor, and Ukraine has huge resources, is because all of the wealth was being pulled out of it by the oligarchs, and actually the IMF and the EU. I mean, Kolomoisky, I think he's Cypriot, Ukrainian, and some other nationality. He lives in Switzerland whilst pulling out billions of dollars from the Ukrainian economy, which isn't there for the actual Ukrainians. So I think that then leaves, oh, now how can we leave the plucky Ukrainians behind? And also we've had many, many reports in the Western press of actual Nazis in positions of power within the Ukrainian hierarchy. We have now, of course, horrendous videos of prisoners being tortured and murdered by such people. I would advise people not to watch those videos, they're horrendous. But that's a reality which isn't being shown. And then, so how do you come to a compromise where if you said things are so black and white? I think that's the biggest problem we'll have going forward.
I think I'm next. So I just, I want to say that we also had one point of our argument was also electoral politics, which we had to delete due to lack of space in the article. But definitely, of course, you know, it's extremely important that, you know, law and justice is the party in power in Poland, which is a very sort of the same in Hungary, right? So you have Fidesz, and then you also have Jobbik in the parliament. So these are very, you know, extreme right parties in power. So obviously, you know, inclusionary, exclusionary processes are also going to be sort of determined by this electoral politics. I just want to point out that, for instance, you know, where Poland, let's say, sort of put people in a hierarchy in terms of entry. So Ukrainians will enter first, then, you know, Nigerians will enter after, and etc. For instance, in other countries such as Romania, people entered on a, you know, first come first served basis. So so that sort of treatment didn't exist in the same way. But what the Romanian did actually, they didn't let in the Roma Ukrainians. Okay, so I think that's why it's again the issue is much more complicated. And I also want to you know, Rogers was also mentioning, you know, sort of the poverty of Ukraine. And I also want to say that people are also bribing at the border. So, you know, it started with, you know, 300-400 euros. Now it's 1,100 euros to go faster. So it's also an issue of class because, you know, the people who were able to sort of pass first there were people that had money. And, you know, being in contact with some of the NGOs in Romania, for instance, people were saying that, you know, those that sort of first, those that passed first, they didn't even want to sort of take any of the, you know, help packages that they were put together by the volunteers because they were just going further, and, you know, they were able to, I don't know, get cars from somewhere and go to Western Europe. So we, you know, but this always happens in every conflict, right? So those who are able to get off first are also those that have sort of some resources, and they're a bit more wealthy.
And being an international student, as I think both me and Raluca have a direct experience of in Canada, is a status of incredible precarity, which then overlaid on a conflict situation and the class brings us to the situation we're experiencing, I think.
Could I just comment on the inside Ukraine itself? We have a reality between ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. So basically the East and much of the South, Odessa, etc., is more the ethnic Russian and Russian speakers, and the West is more the Ukrainian speakers. And that's a whole history which involves multiple empires and the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, etc., etc. We have relatively recently, within the past 100 years, you know, like the Lviv region of Ukraine was part of Poland. So we have that history there as well. But we see that, and when the new government came in 2014, they passed a lot of laws which basically were against Russian speakers, against Russian as a language being allowed to be an official language. Also bringing in a new Orthodox church to push out the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very predominant within the Ukraine, and sometimes forcibly. There's also been, I know the Hungarian population in the east of the country has a lot of issues with the way they're treated by the majority Ukrainian speakers as well. So I think there's a lot of complexity within the Ukraine itself between different groups. They may all be defined as white, but it's more along ethnic, nationality, and religion all kind of rolled together, because the Ukraine, you know, the name itself means the borderlands. There's always been this thing that's been contested between so many different countries moving back and forth.
Okay, thank you. The next person on my list is Vikar.
Yes, hi, thanks. So I come into this discussion as a physicist and mathematician, so I'm going to view things slightly differently. So there are a couple of points I wanted to make and pose questions. One concerns realism and the inevitability of war. And so as as physicists, we deal in realism all the time, but a different kind perhaps, and that has to do with solving equations to determine the future. So when I think of realism in this context, I think of questions such as, was war avoidable? Or is war ever necessary? And what are the steps that one can take to prevent war? So right at the beginning, I remember there was a beginning of the Ukraine war. I remember that there was some discussion about a possible summit between Biden and Putin. And of course, that went off the rails because the Russian forces moved into Ukraine. And so I want to pose the question of, is there any way that we can discuss the situation surrounding Ukraine had, for example, Russia decided not to invade and waited a week for a summit to take place? Now we can speculate about that. So that's one side. The other thing I wanted to address is this issue of nationality versus race. So I used to travel in Europe with a Pakistani passport for many years. And my treatment in Western Europe was not good. Subsequently, I traveled in both Eastern and Western Europe with a Canadian passport. So presumably my nationality is Canadian now. In Eastern Europe, in Poland especially, there was not an encounter that I had that was not racist. Multiple checks of my passport and ticket and so on. And I wondered, and I talked to my host at the University of Warsaw, and he said, unfortunately, I keep hearing that from other visitors too, who are not white in Poland. And I've heard similar stories of Canadian passport holders who are brown, who have gone to Hungary and said, never again am I going to set foot in Hungary. So I think that nationality, at least in my sort of limited, perhaps anecdotal evidence of 15 to 20 people that I know, and the hosts who are from those countries, nationality is no protection, and somehow skin color tops it, or the perception that somehow my passport is also fake, in addition to whatever else they might be perceiving. So I think there's a reality there about digging into the microscopic origin, like we dig into the microscopic origin of matter, we can dig into the microscopic origin of racism and say, oh yes, this dynamical process, this history, that history. But at the end of the day, my experience in the US and Canada, both on a Pakistani passport and a Canadian passport, has been extraordinarily different from both Western and Eastern Europe. And so if you like, that's one data point coming from me that is worth noting down. And I assure you there are lots of others like this in the people I've talked to. So I just want to pose two questions. One is, how avoidable was this war? And second, how much do we want to dig into the microscopic origin of racism versus nationality?
So to address the first question, I think what we had continuously since about 2015, 16, when the issue in the Donbass broke out, basically between the Ukrainian army and the separatist Ukrainians, because they are Ukrainian citizens, was that there was constant negotiation and agreements. There was the Minsk I Accord, there was the Minsk II Accord, both of which were supposed to be implemented to actually solve the problem. It was actually, I think Minsk II was really more a delegation of responsibilities, very much like Canada, like more a provincial level, so that the two Donbass republics could actually protect their own speech rights. You could think of it very much like Quebec protects French. And neither of those were implemented. Instead, the shelling of civilian areas continued, ongoing, killing more and more citizens, completely in schools, apartments, everywhere, directed directly at civilians. What the Russians saw in the past 6 months was lots of people came to chat to them. So the head of France, the head of Germany, multiple people from the US, and they would talk and chat, and the Europeans would be a bit more polite, the Americans would be a bit more arrogant and antagonistic, but the shelling didn't stop. And then in the recent, actually a few weeks before the invasion happened, the actual shelling of the Donbass increased noticeably. And also the amount of troops opposite the Donbass actually increased. And what the Russians are now saying is they have documentation that proves that the actual Ukrainian army was getting ready to actually directly invade the Donbass. That's what their security intelligence was telling them. That's why there are 60 to 100,000 troops in the southeast of the Ukraine completely trapped, because they were all ready for going forwards and didn't think somebody would basically go around them and create what the Russians call a cauldron. So the Russian point of view, and I tend to agree with it when I look at the detailed documentation, is that the West was never accepting of peace. The West would not stop until they had basically cowed Russia, that Russia would now be, you know, the good Yeltsin and not the bad Putin, if you like. They would follow instructions, and that would just continue on. And of course, they'd seen the coup attempts in Belarus, the coup attempt in Kazakhstan, the attack by Azerbaijan, all on their borders, as detailed by the Rand report of exactly what the Americans would do. So in the end, they said, well, we have to invade, because the last thing we want is the Ukrainians going through the Donbass and then using the civilians of the Donbass as human shields against us. So that was immediately when, first of all, they recognized the two Donbass republics, but that didn't stop the shelling at all. The shelling actually intensified after the recognition, and also the sanctions were so extreme anyway, just by recognizing the two Donbass republics, the equation said just go and invade. So I think, you know, this, for the past 20, 30 years, there's been a possibility of not having a war. I would tend to blame the West much more than I would blame Russia for the fact that we're now having a war.
Thank you for the question. So to respond in terms of how much do we want to put under the microscope nationality and race, I mean, I don't know. Let's say my main issue is I think we sort of dissynonomy that is being drawn between sort of indirectly between sort of Ukrainian refugees and privilege, because I think that's where things are getting a bit weird, conceptually speaking. And also, you know, to give some personal example, I mean, you know, I had some small experiences of xenophobia in Canada and more in the US, but some in Canada, but, you know, nothing really bad. But for instance, in Western Europe, I had extreme examples of xenophobia as a Romanian. I mean, in 2019, and I think it was right before actually when Sean waited with a few colleagues at the airport in Halifax. We met there and we got a ride back to Fredericton together. It was right on that trip when I came from the UK, and I was told on the street in Cambridge to go fuck off to my country by British. So I think, you know, I also come with the experience, you know, anecdotally of, you know, being from Eastern Europe. And when I go to Western Europe, I'm constantly being treated, you know, horribly. I mean, I'm not being treated the same in Canada, but I don't think because Canada is necessarily not xenophobic or nice. Although, to make a parenthesis, you know, being here on the East Coast, it is quite different, right? People constantly talk to me as I'm, anyway, as I'm unable to understand English, for instance, right? But still, in Canada, the treatment has been nice, but I think it's particularly because, you know, Canadians don't make a difference between, you know, Eastern European states and, you know, Portugal or Spain or other nations. But I do think that, you know, we need to understand that, you know, that Europe is an hierarchical place, and that Eastern Europe has never sort of been part of the West. And I think, you know, that's the reason why Ukraine is being bombed right now in a conflict that's actually being waged between Russia and NATO. And Ukraine is just sort of there, right? But no one actually cares about Ukraine. And I think it also has been so cruel to sort of, even with this sort of NATO carrot being dangled right in front of Zelensky. And then obviously when there was never gonna be any help coming from NATO. And I think, I don't know, I feel that I'm not being as coherent, but I think overall, we are here in a nation in Canada, in a part of the world where, we're never going to get bombed. And I think, we need to also understand sort of the Eastern European region as being very complex, as being very overcome by all this, ethnic and religious differences. Again, as how Roger was saying, that you never see anything in the Western media about how Ukrainians were treating, the Russian ethnics, for instance. That conversation is inexistent. Or the fact that, in the East, none of the population, for instance, wanted EU integration, or they didn't want NATO integration, right? So these are also other sort of axes of differences that, what I'm trying to say, we need to understand. And sure, Poland has a right-wing government, and I'm not saying there is no racism in Eastern Europe, but I think this sort of de facto position of I don't know. And if you look, for instance, and then I shut up, a scholar such as Bridget Anderson, she says that in Europe, for instance, nationality and race cannot be entangled, for instance. But then she also says that, Eastern European are sort of racialized, which others saying, they're not because they're white. But anyway, things are complicated.
And I just wanted to add, I don't think it's a either or question here when it comes to like putting things under a microscope. I think we're talking about a very specific form of exclusion here that's happening at the border and is having direct consequences. So let's look at what that form of exclusion is. And I think what also prompted Raluca and I to engage in this conversation was that was the first thing that sort of emerged in this Western critique. Whereas from our experience working on borders and working and looking at different levels of exclusion that are happening on the eastern peripheral border of the EU, sometimes it's race, sometimes it's not, but there's always a level of complexity which hasn't been done justice with, and which is in line with the ignoring of this entire area. So let's think of our article also as an invitation to a conversation, getting to know this area a little bit better.
Good, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think Matthew has a question or a comment.
Yeah, and recognizing that we don't have a lot of time, I wanted to push back a little bit on both of the presentations, but I don't think we have a lot of time. So the one thing that I wanted to ask Roger, two things. Like, number one, NATO says that they weren't trying to expand eastward, but that these other countries wanted to join NATO as kind of protection of themselves. So, I mean, what do you say to that? Because I think there are several things that can be said, right, about it. But the presentation that you've left us with today has really kind of followed a more Moscow-centric explanation for what has happened. And so I just want to kind of push back on that, because I don't think that that's necessarily the place to center a realist argument either. And I don't think that's not how I read your article in Canadian Dimension. And I'm not sure what you're thinking exactly about that, but I just wanted to ask you about that. And then, you wrote that piece, I think 2 weeks ago. What's changed? Because it seems as though maybe things have changed a little bit. I'm a little curious about that. And if you could also very specifically speak about the refugee element of this. Like, I think that the one thing that we haven't explored in this panel is, I think that the centrality actually of the refugee crisis aspect of the overall Ukraine war. As Raluca pointed out, it's like no one cares about Ukraine. No one cares about Ukrainians. It seems. And, so Russia is like destroying these cities, many of which, Mariupol and Kharkiv, are in the east. So you know far more about the ethnic politics of Ukraine than I do, but how does that fit what is the idea here? Is it necessary to have any people in Ukraine, or is this like just a grab for resources and territory? And Raluca, similarly, like centering the refugee crisis in the conflict, the European Union has always had. I mean, I would push back on the racial formation stuff, but we don't really have time. But the European Union has always had a different relationship towards the East. So refugee and asylum laws during the Cold War were designed specifically for people who were fleeing the other side of the Iron Curtain. And it seems as though there's been a return to that type of sense of how to receive refugees in the West. But I wonder actually, how's this going to age? Because I don't see Ukrainians returning to parts of Ukraine for possibly quite a long time. So, is there a possibility that there will be, that Ukrainians will be received as special not like Syrian refugees, but a better status with better rights? Or will eventually the kind of culture wars, anti-immigrant culture wars of the EU kind of also wash over the Ukrainian question?
So to answer the question about NATO, from 1991 till 2022, Russia hasn't started a war with anyone. So it's hard to consider why people would consider Russia as a threat, that they would have to join NATO to defend themselves against a country that has not invaded anybody for 3 decades, basically. During that time, of course, NATO, the US has invaded many, many countries and also caused other issues with many, many countries. When we look at what's changed my mind a little bit, I think, is the statements of Western leaders, especially when they talk about turning the Ukraine into another Afghanistan for the Russians, turning into quack. What that means is the destruction of the Ukraine. What that means is millions of dead Ukrainians. Like, actively arming the Ukrainian public is insane. I mean, if you want to die really quickly and you're not trained in the military, grab a gun and try and take on the military. You will die really quickly. It's insane to give individuals who are not properly trained guns, and they're constantly rearming the Ukrainians, which is basically there's a classic saying that the Americans will be happy to fight to the last Ukrainian, or the Europeans will as well, which is very obvious right now. So it appears to me the Europeans, NATO, don't care about Ukrainians at all. They don't care how many Ukrainians are going to die, because they're feeding the military in, and they're making sure there can be no compromise agreements, which could have been reached even now to stop the war. So there's very little care about Ukraine. They're just bodies to be used against an enemy. If we look at the Russians, they've actually, most of the cities, the Russians have actually just surrounded. It's very much the technique they used in Syria. They don't tend to storm cities. So you haven't seen stormings of most of the cities. They've been surrounded, but actually going in and leveling cities and killing large amounts of civilians hasn't actually happened. I mean, we're talking about civilian deaths counted in the thousands, probably not even the tens of thousands, which is a very, very low for such issue. With respect specifically to Mariupol, Mariupol was the base of the Azov battalion, the actual Nazi Azov battalion, 14,000 who basically fought to the death in Mariupol. There's many, many interviews actually now coming out in the Greek press, because there are many Greek citizens and ethnic Greeks in Mariupol talking about how the Azov battalion wouldn't actually let the civilians out of Mariupol. So the Russians had pretty much had no choice. If you see the techniques of the Russians in Syria, they open up basically humanitarian corridors and let people leave. That's why people can leave Kiev right now. There's lines left for them opened. In other cities, they've done that. Now, pretty much the Azov battalion has been destroyed in Mariupol. It's completely gone. But it's not been the technique of the Russian army, as the US did in Iraq to basically flatten cities with carpet bombing, to do that at all. Now they've got another area in Kharkiv, which is the same thing is happening. Now, normally in war, if you look at the history of war, most cities are given up. They're not destroyed. So if you look at World War II, Paris was given up twice, once by the French to the Germans, and secondly by the Germans to the French, so that Paris was not destroyed. And the rules of war actually say that civilians should be allowed to leave cities. That's normal. So right now, yes, Mariupol was destroyed because none of those rules were followed. And the Azov battalion pretty much knew, they would be tried for war crimes by the time if they were taken by the Russians. You've seen the same in Kharkiv, but you've seen very little destruction in the other cities. They're pretty much surrounded them, but they're not destroying them. The bombing that's happened has been actually with military targets that have been taken out. They're not mass bombing. There's certainly no dumb bombs being dropped. It's kind of carpet bombing processes on cities. So I think we really have to step back from a lot of the propaganda to say what is actually happening on the ground in reality. People may say that's me taking a Russian point of view. I think that's me taking a relatively accurate point of view of what's happening on the
ground. Thank you, Matthew, for the question. I just sort of want to add to what Roger was saying. So I put a link in the chat from the NATO website. So if you look at point 23, this is after the Bucharest summit, where I think everything that was bad with Ukraine and Georgia happened. And if you look at point 23, and I'm just going to quickly read, it says, NATO welcomes Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspiration for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. So I just sort of want to point out, because I think, again, this element is completely being erased in the Anglo-American world, that, this was not something, and, I'm not a fan of Putin. I hate Putin, but I just want to say that NATO has also dangled a certain carrot, right, in terms of Western integration. And I think, the idea was that, they want, they did that. So they did promise, they did say, okay, maybe it wasn't, in the most direct manner, although some could say that this is a very direct statement, but there was, sort of the promise of this integration happening. That's why Ukraine put it in its constitution. So I think we have to really, be cognizant of all this. And I guess in relation to Matthew, what Matthew was saying, I don't want to launch myself in sort of any predictions, but if you look historically, Western Europe has only helped the Eastern Bloc when it was beneficial for them. So I think that's going to, again, happen now at some point. I don't know exactly, where things are going to go. But I do think that if you look at Germany, I think they end up creating sort of certain temporary pathways again for the Ukrainians. And, long story short, I don't know if, how things are going to play out. I do think if the conflict doesn't end soon, then they're going to just be, the Ukraine is a huge country, they're 40-something million. So if you get to, 20 million of refugees in Europe, I think you're going to have a lot of pushback against us. So I think that also depends on, and I think it also depends on other variables, because at the moment you only have right now women with children, right? So it's again very gendered, because it's so much more easier to feel empathic towards, women with babies fleeing, right? So I think that also plays in the context.
Just to go on your point there, men between the ages of 18 and 64 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So that's why it is women and children.
Yes, but I think now, because they are able to sort of bribe at the borders, some of them are also exiting.
And just to add to Luca's point, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to the labor needs of Western Europe, and especially if we take consideration that Romania has been a huge repository of cheap labor and agricultural labor for much of Western Europe, which was facilitated by the fact it was part of the European Union. So I think any special status that is going to be granted in the future, and I also don't want to predict, always has to be taken in consideration from what the use is to European Union. And I think a country to really keep our eyes on and see these processes probably break down and develop is Serbia, which has now been barred from further process of integration by virtue of supporting Russia. And so it'll be an interesting couple of years.
Indeed. I want to thank tonight's panel on behalf of the organizers, Tracy Glynn, Christy Lane, and myself. It was a really interesting conversation. A video of this panel will be on the ND Media Co-op website, www.ndmediacoop.org. And I also want to just take the opportunity to mention that geopolitics is going to come up in another talk next week on April 6th at 7:30, so in the evening. André Laliberté from University of Ottawa will be participating in the next Global Studies seminar that Sean Narayan and I are organizing. And he'll be talking about Taiwan and China. So we're looking forward to that as well. Please join us if you can, and thank you very much for being here.